When I told a friend I was presenting about gender and political conditions in the United States, she said, well, that's easy. Bring a wadded ball of paper up front and light it on fire, and then go have a drink. And your point will be made. Well, I get her point. Trying to make sense of the nonsensical, overtly farcical, chaotic quality of how those in positions of state control and of influence are governing in the United States is not only mind-bending, it feels a little bit useless. Confrontation feels right. Analysis and polite discussion seem beside the point. Nonetheless, Theodor Adorno is an advocate of the apparently useless, hence his assertion that art is the only site of resistance because it is defined by its uselessness in the context of capitalist and instrumentalist modernity. And Hannah Arendt said it was imperative to keep thinking. Thinking, especially in this current moment in the US, is a mode of resistance, given the anti-intellectual culture that has always governed in some ways in the US, but has reached epic proportions in the Trump era. So tonight I want to think with you about the current moment in historical time from a feminist perspective that places gender dynamics and politics at the center of analysis. My talk tonight will focus on how the assaults on life and dignity of anyone or anything that finds itself in the sightlines of the assaults carried out by way of policy, military and paramilitary actions, and rhetorical warfare by Trump and his henchmen and women can be understood as a kind of particular moment in the long, very deep, and always dangerous relationship between masculinity and manhood and what we know as the political and politics. So in assessing this moment, we must capture both the historical trends of dominance and oppression in the United States and the unique qualities of the present. There is something peculiar about the masculinist qualities of the current regime that requires analysis and articulation. We can make sense of it by association with references from history. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE agents, can be compared easily to the brown shirts for the Trump movement. The alt-right and American versions of neo-Nazis are like the Ku Klux Klan dressed in khakis rather than white robes. The Trump cabinet is like all of his officials and people who are on his cabinet are like the sycophants and loyalists, or to use a more contemporary term, enablers of the despots in history and in the present. And the efforts at empire building by Trump and his cronies can be compared and contrasted to empire builders throughout history. Nonetheless, I think it worth discussing the difference of the present moment, the peculiarities and the literal strangeness being made by the current regime of familiar patriarchal and heteronormative arrangements. Feminists follow Foucault's admonition, his advice, to think critically is to make the familiar strange. We make what seems natural and absolutely normal with respect to gender and sex relationships, built on hierarchical binaries and rigid expectations of identity and expression, strange, so we can envision and discover more livable forms of life. Now, the public representations of gender and masculinity in the United States are already doing some of this work for us. They are very strange. So tonight, we'll focus on these representations and claims about masculinity that undergird the violence and the cruelty and the chaos being inflicted. My title slide is an image of a bronze statue of Donald Trump and Jeff Epstein skipping along together. It was placed in the dark of night on the Mall between the White House and the Capitol building in September of 2025. The organizers of this satirical act of resistance had a permit, but the statue was broken down, removed by the park police within 48 hours. It now sits on a Washington, D.C. street corner in front of a restaurant. The reason I use it for the title slide, I hope, will become clear by the end of our discussion tonight. As I thought about how to characterize gendered and sexualized politics in the United States now, Marx's essay, The 18th Brumaire of Napoleon Bonaparte, keeps coming to mind. The rhetorical provocations and flourishes in his essay on France's aspirations and failures under the two Napoleons, the uncle and the nephew, are valuable hermeneutics, teaching devices for understanding our current moment. The most famous of these is his declaration that history repeats itself. First time is tragedy, second time is farce. So we'll return to these hermeneutic teaching possibilities of this characterization for present purposes, but he said a lot more in the essay, the salience of which is really uncanny if we tweak his references. So I'll focus on his description of the election of the nephew of Napoleon in 1849. In his essay, captures what I want to focus on in this evening. So I'll read it only with what's in red. In 1851, obviously, the gender traditionalists now had no choice but to elect Bonaparte. When the Puritans of the Council of Constance complained of the dissolute lives of the popes and wailed about the necessity for moral reform, Cardinal Pierre d'Ailly, the contemporary evangelical right, thundered at them, only the devil in person, Donald Trump, can still save the Catholic Church, and you ask for angels. Similarly, after the coup d'etat, the American male cried out, only the chief of the Society of December 10th can still save the American male. Only male perversion can still save chastity. Only lying and conspiracy theory can save religious order. The child breeder, Elon Musk, he has 14 children with 4 women. The family, he can save the family. Disorder, break the infrastructure of the administrative state, fuck women whenever you can. In fact, advocate rape in public. That will preserve our order of things. This is a brilliant description of the logic of supporters, whether they be traditionalist conservatives or evangelical Christians, of Donald Trump in both the 2016 and 2024 elections. But we still must ask why the explicitly desperate measure of electing Donald Trump in this crowd's view, and why the absurdist representations of masculinity and manhood. The men and women of Trumpism advocate and enact violence against all those envisioned as other to themselves, and thus a threat to their greatness. Those are the material conditions we face in the Trump era. However, masculinist public figures alongside and in sync with Trump and Trumpism, from influencers to commentators to political officials, are representing masculinity and themselves in peculiarly farcical, meaning hysterically exaggerated, and absurdist, meaning impossible to have a meaningful discussion with, fashion. Now, traditional masculinity has always had a touch of the absurd. Monty Python captures it nicely for me almost always. But how do we make sense of how public these absurd representations I will discuss or have become? I keep waiting for someone to stand up and say I'm just joking, but they're not going to. In fact, the press and the commentariat and the academia are taking it all very seriously and having long discussions and doing profiles of these figures to try to make sense of it in some way. It's all being taken very seriously. Trump, like the nephew of Bonaparte, wanted to be president for a decade. This is not because he wanted to do anything in particular or promote any particular ideology. It is because he felt himself entitled to wield absolute power, and the presidency was just another place he could do that. His reality TV show, The Apprentice, again to invoke the absurdist quality of the present, was a performance of absolute power to hire and fire at will, which actually no corporate executive can actually do. He's still performing what he imagines as absolute power. So I say imagines because, in my view, absolute power is an oxymoron. Power cannot, by definition, be absolute. It only exists in relationship to and with others. Those who think it can be absolute are dangerous, but never actually powerful. And therein lies part of our tale, I think. I want to suggest that this unsatisfied and unsatisfiable desire on the part of masculinist figures like Donald Trump, in part, explains why masculinity is on display as explicitly and absurdly as it is in the States these days. It is on such exaggerated display because it cannot be satisfied. It keeps ramping up the stakes in representation and its use of material violence. This is not because others don't attempt to satisfy it. We've seen plenty of compliance in advance among massively resourced and influential law firms, universities, and other targets of Trumpist vengeance. Rather, because it can never be satisfied on terms it lays out, it suffers and becomes ever more spectacularly dangerous. They use the most sophisticated weaponry of the United States military to blow up fishing boats. That's the occupying army coming for us. To blow up fishing boats in the Caribbean. They use masked thugs armed with the most sophisticated military gadgets to arrest 5-year-old boys and men seeking day jobs in parking lots. They threaten military force to take Greenland, which is already open to our militarist and capitalist ends. They demolish the administrative state using a chainsaw as a classically phallic symbol of destruction, as the sign of how effective they will be. And all of this is on very public display, and that's really the source of my inquiry. Not because citizens are using phones to record, they themselves are putting it on public display all the time. In contrast, while the CIA tried to use explosive cigars to take out Fidel Castro, they did it covertly, at least. Masculinity has always had its absurdist elements, but the kind of publicity it now claims is unprecedented. So we can see how the regime is showing up and showing off using hyper-masculinist forms of violence, rhetorical and material, to assert themselves. How are they expressing their manhood? Well, there's Andrew Tate, who rapes, extorts, and traffics women and girls. And he says, I support Trump because I am a man. I am a man because I support Trump. Elon Musk, a breeder of 14 children with 4 women, became Trump's chainsaw massacre man of the administrative state. This is the president of Argentina giving him a golden chainsaw in recognition of his accomplishments. Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, or as he prefers it, the Department of War, spends most of his time, this is real, performing manliness, masculinity on pull-up bars and with push-ups and demanding others do the same, like Robert Kennedy Jr. Influencer Costin Alamariu, otherwise known as the Bronze Age pervert, an influencer, advocates the necessary dominance of the manly male over the feminine female, but as a kind of self-help strategy for men. Fellow influencer, Dr. Charles Cornish Dale, otherwise known as the raw egg nationalist, says, hard times make good men. Good men make good times. Good times make weak men. Weak men make hard times. And the cycle continues. That's his summary of world history. I couldn't help but think of, I don't know if y'all are familiar with the comedian Martin Mull from the late 70s. Have you ever heard the song? Men, 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 no, that, right? Have you heard that? Yeah. Well, that all the men being referenced, all the men, men, men in all of these things, I man because I support Trump, and I support Trump because I'm a man, etc., etc. It reminds me of that song, and I want to point out that in the song, in the video that you can find online, if you Google Martin Mull, the fact of being men among men draws otherwise starving men who are adrift on a boat into solidarity and self-confidence about, after all is said and done, being men. We should note there are no actual starving men in the manosphere, but they do represent themselves as overcoming their suffering by being men among men, holding off, and this will be the part that I'll be discussing in a minute, holding off threats of femininity and, importantly, modernity. Both those elements come into play. So, Tucker Carlson, who I'm sure no one has heard of, right? Tucker Carlson was an earnest conservative commentator at one point in his career. But he's now known primarily for his advocacy of ball tanning. This is an image from his documentary. It's a documentary, right? It's real, it's factual, it covers a real problem about the decline of testosterone in men. And apparently, what is popularly now called the tea crisis is having a devastating impact on all of civilization. So, this is also, if you look at the National Institute for Health, one of the lead essays, is a study that was done on about, 15 people or something, about the relationship between testosterone levels and your likelihood to be a Republican or a Democrat. This is from some graduate students' research, nothing against graduate students, in 2011. And just last year, because of this, was posted on the National Institute for Health website as one of its lead research articles. That's what we're looking at here. The fears of these manly men, and they are a fearful bunch, are always, as I will further discuss, intertwined with a specific threat of the feminine or feminizing forces. This is a thread of continuity, I would argue, runs from the past through the current moment. Even while this regime appears singularly disruptive, singularly dangerous, and singularly unhinged. Our authoritarianism, though, in the United States, and part of the theme here is authoritarianism, I'm not an expert on it, but I had a few thoughts about it, in the United States is different from the claim in the German ideology that the ruling ideas of any given moment are the ideas of the ruling class. The authoritarian current, though, in the United States is not about ideas. Ideas are too grand. They're too much about thinking, too much about rational analysis of cause and effect. No, the authoritarianism in the United States is about identity. Again, not an identity linked to the objective control of the means of projection. It is not merely about interests, which can be clear and rational, if unjust and fair and selfish. It is about the much less clear, but far more grandiose and ephemeral concept of civilization. It is about supremacy in the vague felt sense of greatness, and it's about testosterone, sperm count, breeding, self-referential sexuality, and I'll add headbanging and nudity. Most importantly, however, it is about the fragility of all of the above, about a defensive, resentful, spiteful, reactionary, and dangerous quality of white identified manhood, as they experience in the context of the social and cultural life of the nation, defined by their dominance, crumbling from within, while trying desperately to cast the blame, and therefore cause death and destruction elsewhere. We mock it. These are protesters in Portland, confronting ICE officials in all that military gear. We dress up in blow-up costumes to confront its thugs on the streets. It is consistently shown in public discourse to be a joke on itself. However, as it has become ever more violent, the public mocking, the jokes, the satire have somewhat receded, and rage and mourning at the deaths, the carceral cruelty, and random terror have taken their place. So, my next move in this discussion is to think about the contemporary condition of those we call men and how it is being represented to inspire this peculiar masculinist reaction. So since the early 2000s, there's been quite a bit of discussion in the States about what is characterized quite bluntly as the end of men. So Hannah Rosen, who's a scholar journalist, published a book in 2010 called The End of Men. She includes charts and graphs about educational advancement in the workplace that shows girls and women in the United States to be running well ahead of boys and men in higher education in professions such as the law and medicine. And that is empirically true. In 2021, Christina Sweeney Baird, and I just came across this, it's a fantastic book. She wrote a science fiction book also titled The End of Men, in which a virus goes global, killing only men. 1 in 10 men is immune in this version, leaving a female population across the planet to not only save the men they can, but then to rule and manage the world. Then in 2022, Helen Andrews, in an essay published in Compact, which is a right-wing online journal, warned about the end of men when she wrote an essay for this journal titled The Great Feminization. For Andrews, it is not socioeconomic shifts outside of any particular control of demographic groups that is driving the end of men. Rather, she says that the characteristics she identifies as the feminine are taking over. Feminization, in Andrews' view, values cooperation over competition, security over risk, empathy over evidence, and subjective assessments over objective facts. As students of gender roles, all of what Andrews says and how she maps these characteristics onto gender, as male and female, will be familiar to you. And she says forthrightly that if these characteristics dominate in the public space, it will be the end of men, and therefore the end of times. This essay also garnered a lot of discussion and debate back and forth about whether or not it made any sense. And then, of course, back to Tucker. In a widely discussed documentary, from which I pulled the slide earlier, titled The End of Men, by Tucker Carlson of ball tanning fame, this is full of earnest claims about the food industry and the environment that is poisoning male bodies. Women get one scene about their health and beauty issues in this documentary. Otherwise, it's 35 minutes about men suffering from the lack of testosterone and good health. And so these mind-bendingly absurd claims about rescuing manhood by way of shooting up testosterone, guzzling raw eggs, and hosting man fitness camps. So I was sort of focusing on this phrase, the end of men. Why do they call these books and documentaries the end of men? Are people called boys and men not boys and men if they are failing out of school or being diagnosed with attention deficit disorder or defiance disorder? Yes, that's a thing in the United States. Or any other number of available diagnoses for children? Or if they're not aspiring to professional success? What defines the men that are virally disposed of in Sweeney Baird's book? Are they not men if they're dying? And why do dropping testosterone levels bespeak the end of men in particular? Are people called men really only defined by their hormones? So I still ask, how are these phenomena exactly the end of men? And could it be then that it is the end of men only if people identified as or who identify as men with their testosterone topped up are in charge of life and death, of the levers of political power, the production and distribution of economic resources? And if they are not that, are they something other than men? So this gender confusion is going on in the context of this literature, this track, in the context of public discourse. Andrew's piece is interesting because she takes up a theme in the tradition of canonical Western political theory, in claiming that if characteristics of femininity become dominant, that civilization will fail. She follows in a long line of mainstream Western political theorists deeply concerned about the threat of femininity and the feminine to civilization, public order, justice, truth, and all good things. Femininity is identified persistently in Western political theory and practice as the threat to the space of the political and therefore to the space of civilization. If we read the mainstream of Western canon of political theory, from Aristotle through Machiavelli and Weber to Leo Strauss, with our minds on how gender and sex are integrated into their discussions of the political, we see that Western civilization is built by a politics that defines itself in the process of beating back, strategizing against, and suppressing all associated with femininity, i.e. fortuna, infantile dependence, desire, passivity, guile, deception, the particular, thank you Hegel, and the household. Thank you again. Well, Aristotle really. Andrew's essay blames feminism for the feminization of everything existing, but spends most of her time raging against femininity as a social construct, taking over public settings, law firms, higher education, political office, and corporate boardrooms. So each of these pieces claim men are losing something they had. In Rosen's account, good-paying blue-collar jobs, the entitlements to success and profession and politics, and importantly, a sense of where they stand as men with women. In Helen Andrews' account, masculinity is losing to femininity as a social construct. It's very sophisticated of her. The tragedy of the contemporary moment is that masculinity has made civilization and femininity is undoing it. In Tucker Carlson's account, unless we realize how the food industry has poisoned men, decreasing testosterone levels in male bodies, the political order is destined for collapse and failure. I just have to point out the obvious. They don't think the end of civilization will come with communism anymore, or even because of feminism. By those rhetorics, or even because of terrorism at this point in our moment. Though those rhetorics have also taken up some space. We're all communists, feminists, et cetera, if we disagree. But nonetheless, I see this other tendency to be, obviously we're just not that worried about communism or terrorism anymore in this space of the political. So by a feminist account, what men are maybe losing are the resources and cultural capital to claim supremacy and dominance. They're losing male prerogative to claim supremacy over anyone identified as other, the immigrant, the woman, the girl, the LGBTQIA person, the African Americans, the ethnic other. This prerogative has eroded. In part because of all the activism of these groups, of these folks, and obviously in part because of the neoliberal erosion of a weak, but nonetheless ever-present administrative state that in fact helped those identified as men more than it helped those identified as women. Feminists would argue that men are not wrong in their feeling that their status is shifting. They would disagree with the hysterical representations about how that decline is driven by conspiracies on the part of the food industry, the feminization of everything existent, or with Helen Rosen's more moderate account that represents social and economic accomplishments as a kind of race. That's the other sort of tendency here. It's always a race that men and women are winning or losing in these narratives. So the terrifying, to some, erosion of naturalized masculinist prerogative, entitlement, access to resources, contextualizes our political condition, where Donald Trump can be elected president, and where an authoritarianism takes on the peculiar, farcical quality it has in the US today. I cannot help but see a kind of desperation communicated in the representations I put in the slides, in Trump's erratic executive orders, and the clear incompetence of his cabinet vis-a-vis achieving any vision of greatness. As a feminist observer, I'm interested in what is happening now that manhood and masculinity has come out from behind the scenes, in some sense, to defend its righteous place in the world. This follows from my sense that once what had functioned as an invisible norm is overtly challenged, just like heteronormativity was challenged with the rise of the gay liberation movement, masculinity was challenged with the rise of the feminist movement, it must begin to explain itself And when a norm has to start explaining itself, it is no longer necessarily a norm. It's a choice, we might say, but that's too black and white. I'm looking at you and thinking, does that make sense? When norms become visible, normative orders shift. They require explanation rather than simply being assumed to be constitutive of reality. Historical shifts in social movements for sex, gender, and race justice have made otherwise invisible norms subject to scrutiny. In 2014, I'll just talk a little bit about the relationship between the political and manhood, just to give you a little bit more of a sense of where I'm going in this context of the relationship between manhood and politics. In 2014, Mary Beard, a classicist, published an essay about masculinity and politics in the London Review of Books. She begins with an anecdote about Homer's text, the Odyssey, considered by some to be an inaugural text of Western civilization. In it, Penelope, the long-suffering and waiting wife of Odysseus, comes from her chamber into a room full of male suitors trying to get her to abandon her duty to wait. She comes into the room and asks for a different piece of music to be played. And her son, Telemachus, holding court in the main hall with all these suitors, admonishes her to take herself back to her chambers. He says, "Speech will be the business of men, all men, and me most of all." It's really quite comic when you start playing with it a little bit. "For I am the power in this household." Essentially telling her to keep her voice in the space it belongs. From there, Beard traces the struggle for women's voices to be legible in the public space, to be credible in the public space, ultimately arguing that masculinity and the public space are like a hand in a glove. To be masculine historically has been to fit, to be recognized, legible, and accepted in the public space. To be feminine is to either be a threat or an anomaly or a deviant figure in the public space. Further, and this is important, acting and speaking in the public space is assumed to augment masculine characteristics and to diminish and distort feminine characteristics. Males can be real men, whatever that means, in politics, but females cannot be real women. And God forbid, a male person acting in the public space should be accused of being like a woman or feminine. So Beard's approach shows us that one's relationship to masculinity and manhood defines the terms of one's credibility in the public space. Another thinker that I rely on in looking at this relationship between masculinity and politics is Wendy Brown, who wrote a book called Manhood and Politics in 1998. She was writing at a particular juncture in the feminist movement, and she observes that there are fractures when she's writing in the historically symbiotic, in the West, symbiotic relationship, close relationship, intertwined relationship between manhood and politics. She says at one point in the book, in a sort of hopeful voice, manhood is partially undressed. 27 years after she wrote this book, as spectacles of testicle tanning attest to, manhood is literally stripping itself down to show what it is really made of. In other words, manhood is constantly feeling compelled to tell the story of itself, to display itself as spectacle. As manhood ceases to be the norm with respect to politics, it is increasingly made visible. It exposes itself to inspection as an object of analysis. We are certainly in that place after 100 years of feminist scholarship and activism, and the socioeconomic changes drawing women and other feminized subordinate figures into the public spaces of formal education, paid work, and an officially sanctioned political route. So Brown does not argue, like Rosen and Andrews, that women are winning or becoming too equal, which is the other way that it seems to be framed. She has more modest claims as a critical thinker to stand in the cracks and the fissures we can identify and examine and critique what seem to be normal existence. It's a little bit Kantian, an emphasis on reflection, on critique, but no feminist ever argues to also obey, the way Kant did. This emphasis on reflection and critique for Brown and other feminist political theories is always intrinsically linked to acting otherwise. We are now seeing the intertwinement of masculinity and politics quite clearly in all of its self-professed glory, as Tucker Carlson, among others, claim that unless we increase testosterone levels in male bodies, the political order is destined for collapse and failure. Like Mary Beard, Brown argues that whether it is a figure identified as a man or a woman, it is the form of politics as masculinist that matters. So no matter the issue, abortion, military policy, taxes, the manner and the voice in which it is brought to the table, worked out, and decided are masculinist. In the mainstream of Western political theorizing, the feminine is a problem to be solved by manly politics. It's an object of political theorizing, femininity, requiring a response. So we know that Plato reduced the differences in the genders in terms of the significance of those who could rule to almost nothing. He said that women should be in the gymnasium with men, much to the horror of his friends. But then his student Aristotle said, no, 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 that's not how it's going to work, because women, we must reflect in politics, this is important to feminist theory and political theory, we must reflect in politics the natural order of things. The political must separate itself from the necessary spaces inhabited by women and slaves and the children, those spaces where we have to eat, where we have to defecate, where we have to get dressed, where we have to make dinner, where we have to do things in order to survive, and men can go out and then do their greatness in the public space. And no canonical male political philosopher has ever gone back. With Aristotle, masculinism becomes the norm of the political space and femininity the inverse, that from which man must alienate himself to achieve excellence. With Machiavelli, the political becomes the space of virtù, persistently battling the wiles of fortuna. With Weber, the political becomes feminized in itself as transitions to modernity and bureaucratic governance. Feminization, in Weber's view, could be said to be complicit with the iron cage of modernity. In challenging the associations of masculinity and politics and subsequent blind spots, feminists have theorized the personal, the spaces to which women and all others are relegated, as political. We should note that the background noise to ICE raids, the blowing up of fishing boats, that noise provided by internet influencers like the Bronze Age pervert, the raw egg nationalist, along with the more obviously dangerous Andrew Tate, Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, pickup artists, incels, all focus on the personal, the body, the hormones, the genitalia, the self and the projection of self, sexual prowess, diet, the brotherhood, the mythical, and what they claim are forgotten histories of mostly Roman manhood. These are like funhouse mirrors of feminist thematics over the last 50 years. Feminist calls to politicize the personal have devolved into neoliberal mimicries of prior political intentions, making them available for pickup by men in their pseudo-political behavior on social media, in the woods, in rural spaces, in basements, with video games. Another sort of sign of this, of the sort of confusion of the personal as political in this view, Matthew Taylor recently did a kind of update of the studies of the authoritarian personality that Adorno and the Berkeley team did back in the late 40s. And he discusses the formerly kooky religious impulses that have now come to inform the Trump administration's strategies as the fringe. We used to call this the fringe of politics. It's become the rug. The prophets of masculinity of the Trump era trumpet that the personal is political, and that means, fundamentally for them, aspiring to manhood to take back the political. This brings us back to the figure of Donald Trump. You're welcome. I don't think Donald Trump is an authoritarian. He's not even political as a person. Hence my first salvo to analogize, to make similar, to find the similarities between his network of manly political creatures to Napoleon's, to indicate the desperation of those who deeply feel the normative and righteous connection of their manhood to politics and of politics to manhood is fading, eroding, in trouble. The point here is not that Trump's political successes is driven by personal attachments imagined by voters. That's all true. Trump voters have very odd parasocial relationships with their leader. The contradiction Trumpism faces is that his minions are using the institutions of the state to depoliticize power, to privatize public goods, not in the name of market principles like in the neoliberal era, as much as in the interest of a man's legacy as a private individual, as a single person, by personal fiat. Trump and Trumpism, Trump is all ego. He has no superego. Certainly very little libido or desire in him. He does not represent economic man or political man. As Brown says, Aristotle, Machiavelli, and Weber did before them. I would argue that Trump's minions are, in fact, undermining their own aspirations of holding on to the space of politics, defined by them as the dominance of some over others, by making use of Donald Trump. The very odd thing about Donald Trump is that in the only specifically political role he's ever taken on is the presidency. He uses masculinist references and asserts his own manhood, but he does not perform or act as a man of politics. He speaks only in the apolitical language of loyalty, transaction, personalized love and hate. He addresses crowds and television audiences as if he is a person speaking with them in private places, the locker room being the main privatized space that comes to mind when thinking about his manner of speech. He has no rhetorical skills, linked historically to what Telemachus insisted was the business of men, speech, by which Telemachus meant address to others. Donald Trump is a non-political figure in control of enormous, unfathomable material and cultural resources. He is an authoritarian leader who has no authority, if by authority we also mean command of how anything, including political speech, works in the masculinist tradition of political rhetoric. He is completely and utterly dependent upon others, Susie Wiles and Stephen Miller, the hacks at the Heritage Foundation, for any direction. He sits at the center of a web of controllers and handlers with conflicting but masculinist priorities. He himself has little in the way of plan. He repeats publicly, and there was a study done on this, but it showed that Trump has the habit of repeating publicly, literally what the last person he spoke with said. You heard, yeah. If they're nice to him, he reflects positively on the conversation. And if they're mean, he rages about the insult. And you see the pattern over and over and over again. Is he useful to those who would advocate authoritarian over liberal politics? Absolutely. Is he himself authoritarian? He did not raise his children with the values endorsed by many who responded to the surveys administered by the Berkeley team, for example, or more recently by the researcher I mentioned earlier. I'm not sure he would understand the questions on surveys that tease out the psychology of the authoritarian personality. He has no ideas about raising children. He is as indifferent to family values. He is absolutely indifferent to the family values his followers adhere to. He is as indifferent to those family values as he is, I think, to politics. Trump is not exactly a floating signifier when it comes to politics, but he neither appears nor performs nor seems to concern himself with what all of Western political thought, mainstream, critical, and otherwise, has argued to be the business of politics. He will be written into history as president. The legacy of authoritarianism is not his to claim. Because he is identified as male, we refer to his behavior as political. If any kind of person that was not recognized as male spoke and acted as he does, they would be illegible. They would not be legible as a political figure. This is the turning inside out of the political in the United States. The political is not a space of masculinist expertise, authority, rhetorical finesse, or leadership skills. It is now a space of personalized masculinity, evacuated of all those things. So I'm going to go back. Oh, there's, oh, this is the Mend of Men, by the way. He's very clever. This is the raw egg nationalist as he really looks, but this is his, that's how he represents himself online. So just wanted to say. So let's go back to the 18th Brumaire. Driven by the contradictory demands of a situation, being at the same time like a juggler, under the necessity of keeping the public gaze on himself, as Napoleon's successor, this is reference to the nephew, 1851, under the necessity of keeping the public gaze on himself as Napoleon's successor by springing constant surprises, that is to say, under the necessity of arranging a coup d'etat in miniature every day, which is definitely what it feels like, Bonaparte throws the whole bourgeois economy into confusion. Yep. Violates everything that seems inviolable to the revolution of 1848. In other words, what seemed inviolable to the traditional conservatism that was more or less hegemonic in the United States over the 20th century, or the administrative state, the New Deal state, since 1931. Those things just seemed sort of inviolable, like they were just there. He makes some tolerant of revolution and makes others lust for it, and produces anarchy in the name of order. And this line really got to me. While at the same time stripping the entire state machinery of its halo, profaning it, and making it at once loathsome and ridiculous. So I could do a whole Foucault thing on that, but I'm not going to. It's just an impressionistic sort of sense that this just makes a lot, it helps us think about Trump. The cult of the holy tunic after Trier, the Catholic relic allegedly taken from Christ when he was dying and preserved in the cathedral of Marx's native city. He duplicates in Paris the cult of the Napoleonic imperial mantle. And here's what I want you to focus on. He duplicates in Paris in the cult of the Napoleonic imperial mantle. But when the imperial mantle finally falls on the shoulders of Louis Bonaparte, the bronze statue of Napoleon will come crashing down from the top of the Vendôme column. So, in this last line of this second passage, we see the dialectic represented in dramatic form that follows from the dramatic narrative through which Marx represents 72 years of French history. And now we have this. Epstein and Trump. Not the bronze statue of the history maker, but the bronze statue that farcically represents farcical masculinist dominance and power. But never mind that for a moment. Marx's last line is truly optimistic. As the masculinist mantle of patriarchal dominance falls on Trumpian shoulders, will the normative order that relies on the symbiotic relationship of manhood and politics come crashing down? Probably not. Marx frames his detailed class analysis of the 18th Brumaire, when Napoleon II took their self-proclaimed rightful place in French history, with brilliant provocations and rhetorical flourishes. And he ends with a no less dramatic image of real history-making state power, dying its last gasps as it wraps his mantle around a farcical version of itself. The dramatic witness Marx bears, writing in the midst of the 18th Brumaire, offers background for the questions I raised this evening in the midst of our current circumstances. There is a perennial question: how and what can we know about history and how it will move forward while in the midst of it? Not a lot, I would argue. For example, is Trumpism a last gasp of patriarchal dominance? Is it a backlash that will allow the traditional status quo to kind of settle back in? Because normal patriarchy is so much less obviously violent and chaotic. Is it battering what Wendy Brown has called the plasticized cage of late capitalist modernity, and allow maybe a different future to emerge. Or maybe it's just a distinct moment in contingent and unpredictable historical time and space, the outcomes of which cannot be foreseen. What I will reassure you of is that there is remarkable counter-protests in the reclaiming and transformations of the political space in the US. They're happening by way of mirroring the farcical politics we're experiencing. They're happening by way of millions of formerly apolitical citizens becoming deeply engaged, not just as social media warriors, but on the streets, in meetings and trainings, and informal political spaces. The counter-publics generated by the apparent wins of white supremacist, patriarchal, trillionaire-funded politics are transforming the face of American politics in ways as deep as I would argue are the Trumpists. What will come of this, I don't know. But you know what they say about hope.